Shalom, family. I pray that you have experienced the presence of Jesus here with us this morning. And this morning, I invite you to step into the shalom of God. Step into the peace and joy and love of God. Thank you for that prayer, Margie, and thank you also to our praise and worship team for leading us into the presence of God and also just preparing our hearts. I don't know about you and your reading habits. I go through stages where I love to have little bursts of reads, or I have a book that's been handed by me who I've started, and so that's added to my pile of books that's currently sitting on my bedside table. But sometimes I go from there to my screen where, just little short snippets are just what I need for the time. And so I'm quite random at some of these things. One of the most random, well, it's not really random, and I guess it's an ordained reading, if you can call it that, because it got me thinking along the lines of what we are talking about in the next 3 weeks. And I stumbled upon an article from the National Geographic, and it has to do with the return home of the salmon. And the question was posed, how do salmon really know how to trace their way all the way back to the stream to where they were born? I know, it sounds really fun. But anyway, I got caught up in this article and just looked at the research that they did. And also I think when I saw the movie, I think it's salmon fishing in Yemen or something along the lines, which is really, again, random that salmon would go to Yemen of all places. But anyway, reading this article and the research suggests that one of the things that salmon do is obviously they have this piece or this spot of stream where they are birthed. And they are there for about a year or so. And during this time, the salmon actually learns all about the stream with which they are currently in. And then after about a year, they go for their great big adventure and they set out for the big wide open world called the ocean. And they spend about 2 or so or more years in the big ocean. And they say that roughly around this time, when they've matured, they have this inkling to go back to the stream from which they were born. Anyhow, and so they tried to study, how do they really trace their way back? How do they know which part of the stream, for instance, that they were birthed in? And so they did about a 56 years research into this phenomena, which I found really fascinating. I'm like, how do you even do that? How do you research such a thing? But anyway, over 56 years of research, they found that the salmon, during their time of birth and in this time where they lived in this little stream, they had an imprint of the taste and smell of the stream with which they were born. I know, I didn't know that was even possible. How do they know? At the same time, it's imprinted into the makeup of the salmon. The nearest magnetic field that when it comes time to return to their stream, they can trace it back. And so, but one of the things is when you have the salmon out in the big open world, especially in the northern part of America, when they have to trace their way back to their stream, they have this massive island called Vancouver, which is amazingly beautiful. And so the salmon has 2 choices. They can either go the northern side or the southern side. And this determines whether they actually live out their return to their stream. And so they make the journey back. I don't know if you've ever watched documentaries. I just find it the most phenomenal thing to watch. It's fascinating to me. The journey that the salmon makes back to their stream. And for a lot of you, when you watch all of those I actually wondered whether we could have done that. When you watch the documentaries or even little scenes of the salmon, their swim upstream is nothing like we have here. It is actually a treacherous journey for them. It is dangerous, and a lot of the salmon don't make it back for various reasons. You'll have little spots where the salmon is going up a stream, hopping over so many different rocks, and the bear is there. Or they are swimming their way back, and then they might find themselves in shallow water, and so the sun is scorches them to death. But either way, they say that the salmon will get as close as 50 meters, for instance, from the piece of, like I call it the piece of stream, from the actual spot of where they were birthed. And who's read that before and find that fascinating? I think it's amazing. It's phenomenal. And I love this idea. And so this next 3 weeks, as Ewan introduced, we are looking at this whole phenomena of living an upstream salmon life, if you wish. What does it look like for the people of God to live in this current and this time of life? And what kind of tide are we in? One of the things that I have been sitting with and marinating with, and it's been such a blessing, especially in reading this article too and looking into this whole process of returning to this stream, is the treasure that you and I are currently sitting on. That week after week, you and I return home to this particular sacred time and space and group. You and I actually, every single day and moments of our life, go upstream just to return home, whether we realize this or not. But somehow in our makeup, there is this imprint of a return home to this piece of land, to this spot as we have been created to. And this sacred time is called the Sabbath. Now, you might wonder, how is this countercultural? How is this living a life that is an upstream, treacherous kind of life? Well, I don't know if you have recently, well, I'm sure you have. We live in this time. For a lot of us, Sabbath is something that has become a ritual that we have grown up with. Sabbath has become this time that usually we would count down until the next exciting thing happens for the next, start of a new week. Sabbath has become, and, Margie rightly, prayed over, a time when we actually come to recharge. Who's in that space right now? A lot of us would probably say that is Sabbath. Today I want to take you a little bit and I want to unpack a few thoughts with you. And a couple of books that has inspired my thinking and also the way that I love to look at Sabbath is the one by Sigve Tonstad, The Lost Meaning of the Seventh Day, and also the book by Walter Brueggemann, and that is The Resistance of a Sabbath. And here I want to unpack the fourth command that you and I, for a lot of you, well, you've born into this church, and so the fourth commandment has become this imprint, and you return to it. And sometimes we return to it by impulse, sometimes we return to it by a form of ritual. For whatever reason you return to this, it's been imprinted in you. But something about it also has called you to this space that is more than just a ritual. And it's more than just a habit. And it's more than just a time that we have been obligated to keep. I hope that today you can step into this with me and see it from a different kind of way that God instituted this sacred time. So let's have a look. So the command that we take this sacred time is in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 to 11. If you have your Bibles, please turn with me. And it says, and I'll read from the NLT, "Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to your Lord and God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the seventh day, he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. So we've learnt that. We have that. That's our imprint. The first part of this command says, remember. So let's have a reminiscent kind of a time. What is it that God has called his people to remember? Go with me to Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. It's the story of creation. In the Revised Standard Version, it says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. By journeying back to the birthplace of the Sabbath, we are made aware of the personhood of God in the creation story, where Sabbath's intentional creation and birth is both sacred and divine. In his book, The Lost Meaning of the Seventh Day, Sigve Tonstad makes a few observations about our journey to remember, which begins with the creation account of the Sabbath. The personhood of God is revealed in this sacred, divine time. The impact of the seventh day, he says, stands out more by the fact that God completed God's work than what was begun. While God's power is the implied premise of creation, the rest of the seventh day serves an expression of God's personhood more than God's infinite power. Secondly, this sacred time, as we journey back into it, to its birthplace, reveals to us a relational creator. The text says that God Sabbathed on the seventh day. He Sabbathed. God rested. The word rest is one that we love to use. Come Sabbath, we rest. Sometimes we call it lay activities, rest. And I think it's become a custom and a ritual that we love to embrace come the Sabbath hours. But as some theologians would have it, we have not properly captured its original idea and meaning and the best fitting words for it. So I think two of the words that they've come to is that God desisted or God ceased. Almost like God arrived in this time. It's almost like, and they liken it to a train that has come to a halt. The relational implication of the seventh day is often overlooked, dwarfed by the tendency to prioritize God's power, sovereignty, and majesty, which can, in some respect, create distance from the experience that we're trying to have on this particular sacred time. Power and sovereignty are attributes of God, but from God's perspective, it is not power that is projected, but most forcefully in the institution of the seventh day. When God seizes the work of creating, hallowing the seventh day, we see God coming into an enduring relationship with creation. And intimacy threatens the eclipse majesty in the scenario. At the very least, we are led to see God's desire for intimacy in the seventh day, to the point that God's awesome power and majesty are veiled and held in the background. This is something, and this is according to Tonstad, this is something that you and I probably don't think of. We often come to the Sabbath, for a lot of us that have grown up in the church, and they've grown up with the seventh day Shabbat. it's almost like there's been a distance that has been put between us and this sacred time. But in fact, what we do is we put this distance between us and the majesty of God because of the way that we have viewed this sacred time. But in God's perspective, the seventh day actually reveals more of his relational personhood to us that then trumps his majesty and sovereignty. And so by getting into this space of sacredness and beauty and divine time, we are also then looking into the sovereignty of God, a different kind of perspective. And Tonstad goes on to say that this understanding enriches our theology of the Sabbath. Moltmann says, the God who rests in the face of his creation does not dominate the world on this day. He feels the world. He allows himself to be affected, to be touched by each of his creatures. He adopts community of creation as his own milieu. It's a beautiful picture of the seventh day, Sabbath, a sacred time where instead of distancing himself, in this time we are given a picture that God actually comes and is amongst his creation and amongst his creature in this particular time. It's a beautiful, I don't know if you've thought about that and how beautiful it is. Here we are in this space. You and I have gathered as God's created being. And in Ewan's introduction, he said, and his hope is that you walk away having this feeling that God has been saying hello. In this midst, in this moment, in this sacred, holy space, God is amongst us. God is amongst us. And we say, thank you, Jesus. In this space, in this hallowed, blessed space, he is amongst us. He feels our world, and he is here. It's an interesting space because in here, it almost reveals a humble God. And his humility, as Tonstad puts it, on his part negate majesty and self-emptying intimation in the seventh day that does not reduce divine sovereignty. But humility and self-emptying are nevertheless the biggest surprises that he gives. Michael Welker notes, the creating God is not only the acting God, but also the reacting God. The God who responds to what has been created. The seventh day has an interactive character and intent, incarnating God in ongoing experience of human beings. Thirdly, this sacred space. I don't know when the last time you have been given an expression of love or has experienced expressions of love. Today, this sacred time, this divine time when the rest of the world are commodifying, producing, toiling and sweating in this space, God has called you and I to come into a space where his love can be expressed. How beautiful is that thought? That in this divine sacred time, God wants to express his love and his being to you and I. According to the testimony of Genesis, and what is most important to know about God at creation is that God is love. God is love. In this sacred space, what God wants to express is his heart and who he is. He is love. The seventh day signifies what is most essential to know about God. I am ceasing on the seventh day, not only that you may acknowledge and love me, but in order to make it known that I recognize and I love you. So for you who did not know why it is that you've attended this morning, in this sacred, divine, appointed space, God has called you into this space on his seventh day to say to you, not just hello, but he wants to say to you, I recognize you and I want you to know that I see you. I don't know if you ever thought about Sabbath that way, but how awesome and beautiful is that? So in the fourth command, when he says, remember, and God is saying, journey back with me to the birthplace of this institution called Sabbath. Let me remind you that I'm not only saying hello, but I want you to recognize my love for you. I love it. Remember also that God is present. Remembering the seventh day and the creation account lets us know that the creator God of the seventh day is a very present God. The seventh day affirms the presence of God according to Tonstad. In setting the seventh day apart, we do not see God standing at a distance from creation, winding up the clock and then leaving things to go their own way. The God of the seventh day is a near and present God, a person who is committed to creation and one who is involved in creation, up close and personal. And this is the part that I want to spend some time in. He also notes and observes that as we unpack the biblical story of the Sabbath, it is countercultural to its time. One of the things, and we have the fourth command that has been set out in Exodus, but its birthplace is in Genesis chapter 2. In creation, between that and the fourth and the 10th commandment, when it was set out, the children of Israel went through a journey, and we know this. They were, to start with, invited to be in Egypt due to the famine that Israel had been in. But during this invitation and their settling into Egypt, they became a commodity. They became the slaves, and in Pharaoh's system, the Jews and the Israelites became part of his thriving economy. When God called Moses to bring the people out, what God was calling Moses to do was to bring people into a Shabbat. The Shabbat that has become a blessing. So once again, we are remembering the fact that in this sacred, divine, appointed, hallowed space called the seventh day, what God is wanting his people to remember is the fact that this is a time that becomes a blessing for whoever chooses to be a part of it, for whoever chooses to actually seize and be in it. Because in Pharaoh's system, what has happened was, and you know the story very well, that when Moses came to ask Pharaoh to release the people of Israel, Pharaoh wasn't particularly happy, not because of the fact that, he had his slaves, but what Moses was actually asking Pharaoh to do was thrash his economy. The Sabbath was brought into and reminded to the people of Israel because it became this a different kind of system. That the people became the humans that God had created them to be rather than the commodities of Pharaoh's system. And Shabbat became a blessing for them. They were reminded of the fact that in this sacred space, as they enter into the shalom of God, there is a blessing that comes with this time. And so it's interesting because Skinner says about this word blessing, the utterance of good wish applied to things, it means their endowment with permanently beneficial qualities. So the Sabbath is this constant source of well-being. Who experiences this overflowing stream of well-being on the Sabbath? Now, for some of us, it's a stress. I get it. For our worship coordinators in trying to actually get the program going, who in our music leaders, they have to get here on Friday nights, and practice and rehearse. And, our tech guys are under pressure because they want to make sure that the sound is on. And so for a lot of us, a Shabbat may be anything but a blessing. But I hope that in the doing of this, that it is a blessing. that we get to experience in the well-being of being in this sacred time with God. So the Sabbath is a constant source of well-being to the man and woman who recognizes his true nature and purpose. Blessing is therefore standing in the foreground, closely intertwined with God's love and presence that are a part and parcel of the seventh day. The seventh day is a reminder that every time we enter into it, we come away with a blessing. So today, you've entered into this sacred time, and I pray that the blessing of Jesus you get to experience. It's interesting enough that we have this notion that the Sabbath is a time for recharging, and yes, we admit to this, where we come to stop from the toil and the sweat, the commodifying, the consuming of the week, just to stop and to recharge and get ready for another week. But here's God's countercultural thought. And God specializes in this. When we look at the creation account, on the sixth day, God created Adam and Eve in his image. They hadn't even worked. Why did they need to actually observe the seventh day? God did all the work. But here is one of the most beautiful thoughts. And I've grown up with the Shabbat. I've grown up with all the rituals of the Shabbat. But here's something that it never really hit me until recently. The first day of the first humans was Sabbath. And they didn't work for it. They did not need to recharge and cease their work that they've sweated over the last 6 days to do. They actually entered into this day as a gift and as something that God has given them. Just sit with that for a moment. The first humans, their first day was Shabbat. Was this sacred, divine, hallowed, blessed time. And there was no ceasing. It was just entering into their journey into this birthplace of this institution called Sabbath. Barth observes that the seventh day does not come around at the end of the week of toil and labor for human beings as though its primary purpose is to offer a measure of repair and respite after days of toil. Rather, since God's seventh day was a man's first, the seventh day sets life's priority for human beings in the most tangible way. Let me read that again. God's seventh day was man's first, the seventh day, Sabbath. It sets life's priority for human beings in the most tangible way. Better yet, and it's much closer to the point, the seventh day brings to view God's priorities. Human times with the day of rest, begins with the day of rest. Human times begins with the day of rest. Sabbath becomes a decisive, concrete, visible way of opting for and aligning with the God of rest, which is from Walter Brueggemann. So let's just stop there for a moment. Here is the countercultural part of this Shabbat. I've read so many articles, on this whole idea that the secular world is actually teaching for people to have a Sabbath, to recharge. And the whole notion about a Sabbath for business people, for everyone around the globe, is just to stop and recharge, because something happens to our physical and being when we stop, and that is great. But God's idea of Sabbath is that it's not for us to actually come and recharge, because our journeying back home is actually coming home because the Shabbat actually sets us up for the rest of our lives. It's actually a space that God has hallowed, that God has blessed, that God has deemed sacred and divine. It's a space where we get to actually come into and enter into, because it's a space where God actually sets us up for life. It is this time when we can come together, and it's a space where it's not for recharging, it's actually a time of God. And that's a different kind of mindset. We actually start with Shabbat, like the first humans. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Jewish theologian and educator, says, he disavows a theology of the seventh places within the utilitarian framework that is seeing the seventh day as a day of rest that follows work, allowing the batteries to be charged in order that more work may be done. To our minds, rest follows work and is necessitated by work. But to the biblical mind, the Sabbath as a day of rest, as a day of abstaining from the toil, is not for the purpose of recovering one's lost strength and becoming fit for the forthcoming labor. The Sabbath is a day for the sake of life. For the sake of your life, step into the shalom of God. Step into this sacred space of God. It is not so we can regain strength to keep going with commodifying, consuming, producing, toil, sweat. It's actually for the sake of your life that God has instituted this space. And this is the blessing. The last part that I want to actually take us on, and we wrap up, is that this sacred divine time reveals an amazing part of God's character. The relational, present, blessed personhood of God. In the fourth commandment, where he actually gathers his people and says, step into the shalom of my sacred time, but not just you, but also everyone and everything that is around you. And we often quote this in Exodus 20:10. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. This is a liberating theology of Sabbath. The seventh day is the day of justice, revealed and experienced. Thus, the Sabbath of the fourth commandment is an act of trust in the subversive, Exodus-causing God of the first commandment, an act of submission to the restful God of commandments 1, 2, and 3. Sabbath is a practical divestment so that neighborly engagement rather than production and consumption defines our lives. Sabbath as Resistance by Walter Brueggemann. The seventh day helps us see that humans were made to be free and have rest. Humans are not commodities. Sabbath reminds us of a God that includes all in this Sabbath rest. When he ceased and said, I want to experience community with you, it's an all-inclusive experience. And that includes his created beings and creation itself. Due to the fact that the blessing of the Sabbath comes to us with a challenge to adhere to, it's not just a recovery from the working week, but a setting the scene for life we therefore must act. The seventh day must be seen as the launching pad for the most exceptional and ambitious project of justice in our lives. We might even speak of a Sabbathized vision of reality. The Sabbath day orders our steps and helps us to become aware of the people around us. As God has revealed who he is, he's also revealing who we are and the people around us. Freedom from work and exploitation are explicit characteristics of the Sabbath in Exodus 20:10. to some of the most distinguished prophets in the Old Testament, according to Tonstad, the relationship between the seventh day and the course of social justice is so organic that they repudiate any version of the Sabbath that does not reflect this reality. Centuries after Moses laid to rest, the prophet Amos speaks to fellow citizens whom continue to observe the Sabbath and host of religious festivals, but the observance has no meaning because it is divorced from the concern of the poor and the oppressed. Amos sees his countrymen look impatiently towards the setting sun so they can continue their exploitation, their commodifying of humans, and their consuming of what the slaves have actually done. And so he challenges this. When will the new moon be over so that they may sell grain and the Sabbath, so that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the ephah small and the shekel great and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a repair of sandals and selling the sweepings of the wheat. They were not merely impatient to see the sun set so they can get to work, but so they can pursue a course of exploitation. And this is where things get a little serious. Amos makes it clear that his fellow citizens are not irreligious or unobservant of the Sabbath and other religious festival. In some ways, they appear truly devout, and their services are carefully planned and to the minute, and spectacularly executed. But what is lacking in this Sabbath ritual and religiosity is the ethical core, the element without which the religious rituals become meaningless and counterproductive, and we are wanting to be countercultural. The people come across as crass, materialists, riveted by the prospects of the stock market. So they're preoccupied with their own material prosperity, that they have lost the connection between the goodness of God and the well-being of fellow human beings. Amos speaks of people who revel in affluence and luxury while being devoid of social conscience. Amos 4:1. He takes them to task for their opulent, leisurely lifestyle, which has been achieved by exploitation of others and an indifference to the plight of the poor. How's your Sabbath going? Both Amos and Isaiah give the same challenge to the religious people, devout, Sabbath-keeping people. Shaul M. Paul writes, Amos delivered a devastating diatribe against the nation's distorted panache of the cult, the opium of the masses. For him, as for many of the other classical prophets, cultic zeal could neither engender public weal nor atone for infringements upon the moral law. Ritual can never be a surrogate for ethics. Your praise and worship, your coming every Sabbath morning, is not going to negate our responsibility and our core of Sabbath ethics. God desires devotion, not devotion. Or God desires devotion, not devotions. Right more than right. When the cult become a substitute for moral behavior, we are severely denounced and condemned. This is the social conscience for the seventh day. According to Amos, what needs to be offered is not religious rituals, but social awareness and justice that is embedded in the ethics and the core of Sabbath. Amos 5 verse 22 to 24. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amos, on their Sabbath-keeping sacred time, challenges them to the core and the ethics of their Sabbath keeping. What is being their core of worship? Gary V. Smith, Amos's text is an admonition to change the central focus of worship from the performance of the ritual to the establishment of justice and righteousness. And it is clear that the Old Testament, the seventh day, and the social conscience are not in opposition to each other. They are embedded in its core and its value. So the Sabbath rest and blessing that we are is a resetting of our mind frame of Sabbath. It is not for us to continue in our consuming and our commodifying. It is not for us just to pat each other on the back to say we've been to church and we had great praise and worship. If our Sabbath experience and the sacredness and divine time of this space is not actually restoring and helping people to return home to their birthplace in the recognition of their liberation in Jesus, then we have been rebuked the same by Amos and that of Isaiah. Where the rebuke comes, where God says, I don't want to hear your songs again. I don't want to just see your religious acts, because what you're doing is you're acting out these rituals and then you count down the time where you are indifferent to the injustices of the world. What is our Shabbat? What is our Sabbath? Isaiah 58, 6-7. It is not this fast that I choose to loose the bond of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own skin? Is this not worship? Is this not Shabbat? It's a challenge that if our Shabbat experience is not translated into the overflowing streams of justice and righteousness, then why are we gathering? What is the purpose only? Is it for us just to continue in our exploitation and our commodifying? Lastly, but not least, in this Sabbath rest and institution of the seventh day, God is revealed to us with his heart and its core, humanity, all of creation, all inclusive. But also it is a revelation of not just of what we are currently in, but what is to come. A revelation of the ultimate Sabbath rest that we're heading into. The forward-looking stance intimates a posture of anticipation, and yet the content of revelation remains outside the field of vision. God's enduring intention is in view, but is not fully known, and this is where we're at. Our series is about being a countercultural group of people. Shabbat and this sacred time is something that God has gifted us with. It's not just for us to come and recharge our batteries, but actually is a setting of life. It is for the sake of our lives. It is for the sake of everybody else's life that God has instituted this day, because he's completed his work, not ours. He's completed creation. We didn't do it. We enter into it. And from here, the course of our life actually then is paved. And so my prayer for us as a church, and I'm going to call our praise and worship team to come out, in our weekly religiosity, in our weekly gathering, could it be that in this sacred time we come and enter into the shalom of God because it's for our sake and for the sake of others around us? Could we come and enter into this space that is sacred and divine because God instituted it, because it sets us up for the core parts of his heart, and that is to bring liberation and justice to the world? Could it be that this is our Shabbat experience that he's asking for.